think we're live. Anything you say will be recorded from now on. So I wonder where you kind of God, I hope the internet holds up. It looks as if everything's working. There's Tracy Dunbar has joined. Thank you. I'm not very techie, so I was slightly worried that this thing wasn't working. But Kathy Stevenson, Sue Pilling, Louise Taylor, Kenneth, thank you all. Wonderful. So I guess we're going to go in about 3 or 4 minutes. I can't quite work out how you scroll down this thing. Okay. Does anyone know how I can tell how many of you are logging on? Send me a message if you know the answer to that. God, I'm even getting ads. Earn money on your videos. Can you believe that? Could someone just message and say you can actually hear me, and well, hopefully you can see me, but that you can actually hear me? God, there's someone from Minnesota. Oh God, it's all gone away. Okay, I'm going to start. It's just gone 8 o'clock, and I can't quite tell how many of you are out there, but there are certainly some of them, some of you. So thank you very much for joining me today, this evening. It's I happen to be in Cornwall actually, taking a short break, and it's a slightly dull but pleasant evening here. Hope it's nice where you are. I was thinking about tweeting about this event today, and I just suddenly realised that any of you might have seen this in my tweet. I said this that I broadcast to millions every day from the news at 6 on the BBC. I've given lectures in theatres and universities and all sorts of things, but I've never actually done this. So bear with me. I'm just a tiny little bit nervous, but in a good way, I hope. And I hope all the technology holds up. That's the main thing. Actually, anyone who knows me knows that me being responsible for technology is not a good idea, which is why the BBC have these amazing engineers and floor managers and directors do all that sort of thing. Enough of that. Let's get on. So, The Burning Land, this book that came out last year and is now in paperback. And it's been in paperback for a couple of weeks. It's a thriller. That's what the reviewers say, and I must say it's very nice. The reviewers, most of them, have been very good about the book. But I feel that the thriller element of it, for me, at any rate, is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for so much more that I wanted to say, to talk about, to describe. Stuff that I haven't been able to say anywhere else. So I know I feel like a bit of a salesman, buy a thriller and get a lot more, but you do get, I hope, a lot more. Now the book is The Burning Land, and land is at the heart of it. The book is based on the notion, and I can't remember the exact words, but I say something like in the book, something like that the book is based on the notion that those who feel most secure are those whose feet walk on soil they can call their own. So it's this kind of really visceral thing. And I think here in England, in the UK, in a largely urban country, I say largely urban, obviously there are people who live off the land and farmers and so on, but our relationship with the land is mostly transactional. We get a mortgage, say, we buy a property with a garden, and that's it really. We just move on. It isn't about who we are. It's just a place we live in, hopefully a very nice place, and we keep trying to save more and buy better, but it's basically about somewhere nice to live. Now, in much of the majority world, South America, the subcontinent, Africa, land is about identity, because by and large, so many people have had to fight for that land, to have it as their own, or are still fighting for that land. And it's been going on, as I say, all over the world for a long time. If you think about what's going on in Brazil, the competition for land between the big business, commercial interests, and the peasants and the indigenous people. If you look at where I was born in Sri Lanka, there were 30 years of conflict, a civil war. At the heart of that also was the notion about who owned the land and what culture dominated in which bit of the land. You go to the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, that too is about land. So land is not just about a piece of earth, which I'm looking at now, but about identity. And imagine a situation then when in South Africa, this is an imaginary in the book, where there is a new conflict of land. Now here's a country that spent decades in the early 1900s under Nelson Mandela, from around the 1960s, struggling and fighting against apartheid to get ownership of land. But that fight had obviously gone on for centuries before. they get their freedom, and the notion behind this book is, the idea behind this book is that that land that people fought for so hard is being bought by foreigners, being bought by rich people from all over the world who see the prospect of making money. And one of the things I think, by the way, this isn't in the book, or there's a line about it in the book, but I think this competition for land will become more intense as climate change takes effect, because what you will see is that people in the rich world will have, and in parts of the world where climate change really affects them, will find there's less agricultural land, and they'll want to buy it as an insurance policy. So imagine that there is, if you like, a new conflict for land, and this is how there's a group of people, an underground cell, who are trying to make sure land remains South African, and they launch a campaign of sabotage, and this is what they said. The first time they commit an act of sabotage, they post something on the web. Today, a new struggle has begun. Just over 100 years ago, in 1913, the Boers passed a law to rob us of our land. Now we must fight for it again. In Mpumalanga province, a message has been delivered. We did not win our freedom to see the land taken away from us again. We, the people of South Africa, will not sit and watch our precious inheritance sold to the highest bidder. Today in Mpumalanga, we fired the first shot in our fight against the new colonialism. Let them be warned, those who will sell our land to foreigners. The people of South Africa are ready to rise up again. So that, if you like, is the moment at which this new struggle for land in South Africa, in the burning land of my book, starts. Now, the cover of the book says, and it's my publishers Canongate very cleverly came up with this tease: South Africa is ablaze, but who started the fire? And yes, this book, it's a thriller. It is a whodunit, but it isn't always just about who. Sometimes an event there can be an event that changes the course of history. There can be events that speed up history, or seem to speed up history. The things that happen that mean that things you thought were going to take decades suddenly happen just in a matter of years. And if you think about it, we're living through exactly such a period, I think, now, with that killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Can anyone forget those 8 minutes and, 46 seconds or something? And how that speeded up all that argument, the debates and so on about what to do about statues, and suddenly it all seems irrelevant because history just kind of moved on. So that was an event, a pivotal event. Think the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, World War One. I'm trying to think of some other things, images, moments that seem to change history, or certainly have an impact on history. Boris Yeltsin would have been 1991, standing on a tank in the midst of a military coup. Tank Man in Tiananmen Square all those years ago, 1989. Anyway, there are these events that seem to change history, and in the Burning Land there is such an event. It's a murder. It's a murder of a very rich man, the son of a very rich man, a famous family. They've been involved in politics and have then translated that political capital, if you like, into monetary capital. They're called the McClatchy families, and the man who is murdered is Lacetti McClatchy. And here's the thriller bit of it. He's murdered, but is he murdered because his family is known to be involved in land purchases? Is he murdered because he's simply a rich man and someone wants his car? You never know. You don't find out, actually, in the book. You have to read it till you find out, but it happens quite late in the book. So he's murdered, and it is, I would suggest, one of those events that has this kind of impact on history that I was talking about. Sorry if this is all seeming a bit rubbish, me turning away from the camera and so on, but here we go. So, Lacetti McClatchy's murder was one of those pivotal moments that seemed destined to change the course of a country's trajectory. There are some events, a law passed, a speech delivered, a transgression exposed, which are deemed significant only in retrospect. like looking back on a life and realising the point at which things had taken a turn for the better or worse. But this was different. As news of the murder spread across South Africa, its people knew there could be no going back to business as usual. Lacetti McClatchy was more than a man. He was an idea, a symbol, and with his death, that idea had been tarnished. Lacetti had been one of freedom's children, born in the 80s. His life mirrored the changes in South Africa as apartheid's pernicious laws were expunged from the statutes. A quick and confident boy, he'd once been interviewed by a TV crew doing a piece on the role schools were playing in changing attitudes to race. The report had asked a class of teenagers to define racism. In a flash, Lacetti stuck up his hand. He pointed to one of only 3 white children in the class and said, "Well, racism is like, if I'm unkind to Darren and call him names, Whitey and so on." The clip had made it onto the evening news, the reversal of the conventional definition of racism that white people could be victims from the lips of a black child seemed to speak volumes for the miraculous journey South Africa was making. And now he was dead. Even in a country inured to violent crime and a murder rate that saw it perpetually leading the wrong kind of international league table, the notion that Lacetti McClatchy would one day become a victim, another knot on the grim statistics board, was unthinkable. There wasn't a person in the country, whether they spent their time in a township shebeen or a gated mansion, who did not know who Lacetti McClatchy was and what he represented. So who, in their right mind, would want him dead? So, famous man that is killed, and the government knows, because he is so famous, this is a very delicate situation. And what they do in the burning land is they need to blame someone. So they blame the easiest target, which is the foreigner, a migrant worker, a Mozambican, the shirtless, voiceless people who all around the world, whether it's in our country, whether it's in Europe, in America, these migrant workers who keep the cogs rolling in the machine, in our machinery, and they blame this Mozambican, the authorities, and what that does is unleashes a wave of violence against foreigners, and you have xenophobic attacks all over South Africa. Now, this is fiction, but I don't make it up entirely. In South Africa, there have been bouts, not many and not huge, but there have been times when people have turned on foreigners. Southern Africa plays a bit of a role like Europe does to North Africa, and with migrants coming in, very rich countries that people are coming in, and there is resentment about these migrants, and the usual old stories about people taking jobs and so on. And one of the things I've learned actually in 20-30 years as a journalist, and quite a lot of it as a reporter, is that this thing we call civilization, we take it for granted, but actually it's so fragile. It doesn't take much for this thing to be ripped apart. It's just skin deep. And this is not just about Africa or the majority world. It's in our continent too. I mean, you just think of Srebrenica in the Balkan conflicts and how, what happened there, that massacre. And this was in a country where people used to go, to a place, part of the world, part of our continent that people used to go on holiday to and so on. And this happens in South Africa, in the burning land. And into this comes one of my characters, who I'm going to talk about, the main character, Lindy, who I will talk about in a minute. But she's just recently arrived, and she's sort of shopping and so on. And she goes to what are called spaza shops in South Africa, the little boutiques really on the roadside. And she starts talking to the shopkeeper about this murder and what it means for the country. And he just says in a flash, without thinking, he just says, "Oh, don't worry, madam. We'll sort this out. We'll send those Mozambicans back." And that makes my character, Lindy Seaton, think about those words, "send them back." How many times, in how many different countries, and in how many different languages have those words, "send them back," been used? And how many people around the world had heard them and been terrified by what they meant? Those three words robbed them of their identities as individuals, as families and neighbours, even as friends. Them, not us. Them over there. Search them, catch them, arrest them, deport them, kill them. That was all it took. Shift the people from the column marked us to the one marked them, and everything became possible, justifiable. Lindy found those words spoken by the avuncular figure of the smiling, seemingly gentle shopkeeper as chilling as anything she'd heard since she came to the country, to South Africa. So let me talk to you about Lindy. I've had to mention her before in describing her. She is the main character. She's the character around which this novel revolves, and she lived in London. She's the child was born in South Africa. She's the child of white South African parents who fled apartheid South Africa, as many of them did, and came and settled in Britain. Their parents were on the fringes of the struggle. The mother was involved as a lawyer. Her mother, Lindy's mother, as a lawyer in trying to help people with legal problems, black people, legal problems. The father was a journalist and is eventually banned. Things look very hairy for them. This is going back, obviously, in the 80s and so on, and the family moved to London. And Lindy grows up in this exile home. She's never quite sure about this exile. Did my parents really deserve this label, exile? She thinks you need to deserve it. You need to be a real fighter. And she's not quite sure of that. So she's a complicated character, trying to work out the sense of identity, who she really is. By profession, she is a mediator. She works for something called the South Trust, and I think their slogan in the book, I have it as something like local solutions for local problems. And they go out in the world and mediate, try to get people together. And that, of course, is what takes her to South Africa to try and help in this conflagration that's occurring in South Africa. That's the professional part of her. The personal side of her, as I said, is this question of identity, trying to work out where she actually belongs. Is she the parent of exiles? Is she a Londoner? Or is there some visceral connection to South Africa? There's also, she's a clever woman. She goes to has been to an ancient university, but she gets a job in the Foreign Office, but is bundled out because she's just too, she thinks too hard. She's too passionate, and basically gets a sack from the Foreign Office. And with that comes the words I use in the book, I think something like she has a very punishing evaluation of her self-worth. So she takes all that baggage to South Africa to go there as a mediator. And for her, this journey to South Africa, this is one of the other things I wanted to explore in the book, which is, as I say, a thriller. We've had xenophobia, identity, but in this case, for Lindy, it's a chance to reinvent herself. And I think that it's easier for all of us to be someone else when we go abroad, when we go to another country, to another place. At home, we are constrained by convention, people's expectations. Lindy wouldn't do that because that's not the sort of thing she does. She's not that kind of woman. Those kinds of things. And in South Africa, as she works her way through these days in South Africa, she finds she can reinvent herself, think about being the person, the woman she wants to be and knows she could be. The other thing, and you might, some of you, and I know that quite a few of you are women. Maybe I'm being presumptuous, but I think this is probably more likely to happen to a woman. I think women are constrained more often by convention and what society demands of them, because we're still in a patriarchal society than men. So I think that was important to me for the character to be a woman. Now, once in South Africa, she meets. It's very difficult for me, actually, by the way, not seeing any of you, in a theatre or something, to know whether. Well, you are clearly all out there, but whether I hope I'm making sense anyway. So she gets to South Africa and she meets Kahiso. Kahiso is the son of the Seaton family, the house worker. And he too, we just saw the character Lacetti who gets murdered. So he is a product of freedom, freedom which enabled his family to get rich, super rich, immensely rich, perhaps even obscenely rich. And Kahiso is another kind of beneficiary of freedom. He's used his freedom to become something of a campaigner. He works in the rural areas for an organisation called Soil of Africa, and he's basically helping rural poor people come to terms with how they can make their land work for them, to do deals with farmers, most of whom are still in South Africa white, to try and set up deals so that they become more productive. In other words, to make a reality of the freedom that was promised by Nelson Mandela when he took over South Africa. So those are the two characters, and these two characters you will stick with them through the book. It's only a matter of days, but in those days these two characters come together. They have hour by hour they realise that they're not only trying to save, in Lindy's terms, save the country from this conflagration, try and bring people together, but they also find that they have to save themselves. They themselves become targets in this whole thing. So those are the two characters, main characters. There are, I think, most of the characters are women. There's Marka Tiwe, an amazing, powerful woman. I love her. And then there's Priscilla McClatchy, another woman, again another powerful woman. And when I was reporting in South Africa, there were people I thought of when I wrote the book, wrote this novel. These amazing women who were so much a part of the fight against apartheid. Now the book is set in South Africa. It could have been set, by the way, almost anywhere in the majority world, because this competition of land that I was talking about earlier is happening, and it's happening all over the place. In South America, certainly, in other parts of Africa, and in the subcontinent too. And it's a story actually I wanted to do as a reporter, and I never actually got round to doing it. It was just too difficult to do. And I set the book in South Africa, which is in reality the place where you won't see the problem at its worst, but it's a place I know. I lived there for 4 years, the Mandela years, from 94 to 98. And they always say, if you're going to write a book, write about something you know. So that's where it's set. And these days, I just worry, actually, one of the other things I wanted to do was to talk about the real South Africa. And it could have been the real Sri Lanka, it could have been the real Kenya, it could have been the real Brazil. Because so often as travellers, as tourists, I think we go to these countries and we just kind of, we sort of ride along at the top. We never really find out what makes the country tick. And I've always been interested in that, and I've always been much more interested in the back street, if you like, than the main street, the clubs. And I was thinking about this, knowing that I was going to give this talk, and I think it's one of the reasons I was years and years ago really started reading Graham Greene novels, because again, I mean, he's I think it's about these places, these hot, humid, treacly, atmospheric sort of places and flawed people. I'm not for 1 second comparing myself to Graham Greene, but I wanted to describe that kind of backstreet, if you like, and there's a passage in The Burning Land that I'd like to read to you, and it takes place. It describes what's happening in the main railway station in Johannesburg, and by reputation the busiest sort of transport terminus on the continent. There, they say, and it's a melting pot. It's you've got the commuters in there. There's the South Africans. You've got the migrant workers going to their places of work. You've got the migrants who are selling things that they brought from other parts of Africa and so on. And I just love it. And this happens, by the way, you can find it in Kinshasa, you can find it in Lagos, and you can find it in Nairobi. But this just happens to be in downtown Johannesburg. The earliest vendors were already selling an assortment of street food. They were bloodless and dimpled strips of tripe fizzing on a grill. The man picked a piece off the fire, doused it liberally with piri-piri sauce, and blew on it before putting it into his mouth. The sickly sweet smell of rice and mince, cooked over a hissing gas camping stove nearby, reached Lindy and smothered her appetite. Others were unpacking their wares. In a couple of hours, they would be selling everything from fake Rolex watches to shoelaces and polyester corsets. Two of them caught Lindy's eye. Their chatter, loud and ebullient, was in a language she didn't recognise at first, but then realised was a version of French. One had the telltale facial tribal markings, still evident in some of the more elderly migrants from West Africa. They were playing their part in the great conveyor belt of trade, unnoticed in the official statistics, which distributes wealth from Africa's teeming and wealthy cities to its forgotten and poor villages. The meagre profits from a few weeks outside Park Station in Johannesburg would, in the wonderful alchemy of pavement commerce, be transmuted into a corrugated iron roof over a mud hut somewhere in the Bandiagara hills of Mali. So that's a kind of South Africa where this book takes place. One of the questions that, last year when the hardback of this book came out, I was lucky enough to do a proper tour, actually go out and meet people. And one of the questions that came up most often was, pointing to me as a journalist and saying, why novel? Why don't you do this in kind of non-fiction? And I think for me, there isn't actually a huge contradiction. I mean, obviously the different ways of telling a story, but there wasn't a huge contradiction. In a way, this fiction allowed me to kind of fill in the spaces in between my dispatches as a reporter, first in print journalism on South Magazine, and then, last 30 years, can you believe it? Last 30 years as a journalist for the BBC. See, journalism is about facts. We know that. Yeah, it is good journalism ought to be about facts. You go out, you find the facts, you delve into it, you investigate, you find the facts, and you report them. But beyond facts, sometimes there is a truth. You may not be able to find the fact that proves the truth, but the truth exists nonetheless. And fiction allows you to get to that truth. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book as a novel. And also, in 2 minutes 30 on the news at 6, there's, some brilliant reporters manage it. The Clyde Myrie's, the Jeremy Bowens of this world, the Alagiahs, they manage it. But for most people, 2 minutes 30 is not enough to tell a whole story. Whereas in fiction, you can talk about, what really motivates people. It isn't just always about politics. It can be about lust, greed, love, affection, prejudice, pride, all those sorts of things. Fiction allows you to get under the skin. And I think that's another thing that I found attractive about writing a novel. I'm going to, this is a massive name drop, but I'm going to mention Nelson Mandela, who I had the privilege actually of interviewing a couple of times just on my own. But I want to quote something he said, and this wasn't just to me, it was a group of journalists. And every now and then, I mean, it's not a side of Mandela, people kind of saw that often, but he could have a face like thunder. I don't remember if this was one such occasion, but he certainly was pointing the finger at us, foreign correspondents. And this is, he said to us, I can't remember what the context was, but he said to us, you observe from near, but you judge from afar. And I think what he was saying was that we as foreign correspondents, whether we was the BBC, the Guardian, the Financial Times, that we go to, when things happen in the country, we go there, we report from very close, we stick our cameras into people's houses, into their faces, ask questions and so on. But at the end of the day, when we tell the story, when we type up, when we get to the keyboard and type up our scripts or our columns, we do so constrained by who we are and where we're from and who we work for. we are Western journalists, and though we tell ourselves we're being objective, that objectivity means that you're slightly afar, as Nelson Mandela put it, from the people on whom you're reporting. And I think fiction allowed me to report from close, to be the person, to be Kahiso Rapabani, to be Lindy Seaton, and so on. So that was just wonderful to be able to do that. It was an absolute liberation and a revelation for me. So it's a long way of saying, why did I write a novel? Now, I can see I've sort of been going on for quite a long time, actually, I think. One last thing I just did want to say, you might think that this book is about things going wrong, and certainly that's the backdrop in South Africa. Freedom has not turned out to be quite what people had hoped or indeed expected, but it is much more than that. For me, really, the heart of the book is about resistance. It's about people resisting something when they think things are going wrong, and thankfully in South Africa there is still such a vibrant press, there's civic society and so on. Kahiso, the character Kahiso in the book, represents that. And so I think it's actually a book not about things going wrong, but it's about the human spirit. And people often say to me, given the work I've done, I've reported on the genocide in Rwanda, the civil wars in Somalia, Liberia, and places like that, and they say, God, you must get incredibly depressed. And I'm not, actually, because I've seen the human spirit, I've touched it, I've smelt it, I've felt it, and it's really, really powerful. I feel privileged to have been so close to it. And I think in the end, this book is The Burning Land, is about that. It's about these two people, a group of people, two people at the heart of the book, deciding so much and no more. It's about resistance. And I'd like to end, I know, and I hope I'm going to be able to work this, but there'll be questions that will come up on my screen. But before, I want to leave you with, it's Kahiso, this character Kahiso, who I said works with the rural poor, and it's him remembering in all of this that there was a time when he believed another world was possible. I sort of call it Kahiso's dream in my notes. But let me. So he's going back to a time when he was celebrating a success in his work. He remembered the time when he'd helped to organise an end of harvest braai, that's South Africa's version of a barbecue, on a farm right on the border with Mozambique. It was the first year of a profit-sharing scheme that Kahiso had helped put together. The area had been blessed with good rains and a bountiful crop. That evening, as a blood-orange sky had turned purple, as shadows grew longer and fainter till they just seeped away into the soil, one of the migrant workers had brought out his mbira, a traditional handheld musical instrument, a finger piano as some called it. Kahiso had sat on the edge of the group, entranced by this vision of a different future. The farmer and his wife, Afrikaners both, sat near the fire. On the other side of the circle, their children huddled next to the housemaid and some of the workers' children. An old man, rheumy eyes staring into the embers, pulled at a zol, a homemade cigarette spiced with the comforting fragrance of dacha. Women spread polyester blankets over their bare legs, and young men shared the last few bottles of beer. Callous thumbs plucked at the metal tines of the mbira, shaped like the flat handles of tablespoons, and picked out a tune that had been written in another century in the great language of the coast, Swahili. Nobody understood the words, but all were moved by the ballad, the lament of a young suitor who knows he will not wed his angel, his Malaika, for want of a good fortune. Kahiso had looked across at the farmer and was sure he'd seen the man's eyes well up with a tenderness so far removed from the caricature of his people. The morning, he knew, would expose again the starkness of his country's struggle to find a middle ground between great wealth and great poverty, but for that evening, under that deep and star-studded African sky, Kahiso let himself dream. Yes, dream. Dream of another country, one in which hope triumphed over despair and idealism scored a victory over cynicism. There you go. So that's it from me. Let's see. I actually my publishers sent me some questions that had come in advance, so I can do that. But let me see. Let's see if there are any questions. I'm not very good at this. You're going to find out. Oh God, what have I done here? Hold on a minute. I should have just given you all my phone number, then you could call me actually. Okay, so here's how easy was it writing about a female main character? And that comes from Shirley Bustard. Thank you, Shirley. Well, it gets us into all sorts of kind of arguments. There's can a man really write from a woman's point of view? All I can say is that I think it is possible. B, I don't think men should be prevented from trying to do it, and you, the readers, will judge whether it's been done well or not. My sense of it was that maybe it's something to do with my family background. I grew up with four sisters, two older, two younger. Younger sisters, they remain my sort of best friends, and you can't grow up with four young women around you without learning something about how women look at things, and in many ways it was the kind of dominant view in our family. So look, there's how it worked. I've got to say I had a little bit of help, obviously, because what I would do was the character Lindy Seaton, in particular, evolved over quite a few months, and there was quite a big gap actually where I got ill and had to stop writing the book and had to go back to it and get to know her again. And in that process, my wife Fran, what had to be, was my kind of sounding board, and I kept asking, would you do this? Would Lindy do this? And I think she probably knows Lindy as well as I do now. Certainly by the time I finished writing the book. So I had that sounding board, and certainly there were moments when Fran would say, oh, probably not. But anyway, that's so I don't know if I found it easy or difficult, but I felt I could hear Lindy's voice in my head, and it was a case of just kind of making it come real on the page. Okay, now the problem I'm having is trying to work out whether I go up or down on this thing. Okay. Right, I think I need to go down actually for the questions. Samantha Sibley. Was someone talking about meeting me? Sorry, I think you might have lost the picture there. Could probably get your phone. Look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer some of the questions that came to me beforehand through Canongate, my publishers, and let me see. There was The Burning Land feels very real and contemporary. Was it based or inspired by real events or people? Well, they always say, I think you should write about something and in some ways, every part of this book happened to me, or I observed. Although I said, I actually wasn't able to kind of nail the land acquisition story exactly. but yes, I mean, take for example, and I should have said this actually earlier in my remarks. There are probably 2 or 3 scenes of violence in the book, and I guess they are extreme, and I didn't see them all in the same place at the same time, but there's nothing in that book in those scenes that I haven't seen. So there was a sense in which this book is a extrapolation, if you like, of my years as a reporter, and as I said, trying to say the things that I wasn't always able to say in an impartial BBC report. And as I said, I was saying earlier, fiction gave me that liberation. So somebody says, I was about to comment how good your pronunciation of South African names is. Didn't realise you lived there. Let's see if there's any other questions. There's lots of people saying lovely things to me, by the way. You're doing brilliantly. Although that's Anna Frame, that's my publicist. Probably should have read that one out. But other people are okay, no problem in. Let me see. It must be terribly boring for those of you who are waiting. I'm looking forward to reading this. How do you find the time? I assume this is from Philippa Pete. How do I find the time? To write the book, you mean? Will you make the time? I mean, the thing about this, actually, this had a very long gestation period, this book, because I started writing it years and years ago, and I think even written a couple of chapters. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I was diagnosed with cancer. And for a good 2-3 years, I mean, I just had to concentrate on trying to deal with that. So nothing happened. And then when I went back to it, I had to make the time. But it wasn't difficult, because I think, and this is probably true for lots of journalists, there's one side of us that is the kind of like day job, the reporting, the fact-based discipline that we have. But there's always for me anyway, there's always a kind of creative impulse, and so I just made the time, and it was pretty painful, I think, for the people around me, mainly Fran, my wife. But yeah, weekends, every sort of couple of 2 or 3 weeks, there'd be we'd take a weekend, and I would just work solidly on the book, sometimes in the evening, sometimes early morning, and so on. But I think you just kind of make the time. And I've got to say, it wasn't ever. I didn't feel like. I'm not going to say it's easy. I think the plotting, the characterization, that took work. But the actual writing of it, I really, really enjoyed. And I saw the book as a series of pictures in my head, and maybe it's because I'm a television journalist, and I could sort of see Lindy in a certain situation, or I could see Kahisa doing something. And kind of all I was doing then was just kind of on the keyboard, kind of writing what I was seeing in my head. So I kind of enjoyed that, really. And so yeah, what wasn't onerous. Let's just see. What are you looking forward to the most as life is getting back to normal-ish? Well, I think actually the thing I missed most in lockdown, and in fact I did a very short essay for Radio 4, the Today programme, on this, and it was about halfway through the lockdown, and it made me think very hard. And it's that thing of touch, that for example, my granddaughter Mina, who's 20 months, I think, something like that. And well, we can see her for a start. I mean, apart from kind of like on FaceTime and so on. And then the couple of times we did meet, and when we were allowed, those weekends we were allowed to get together in gardens, you still couldn't touch them. And I suddenly realised how important that is. What an important way of showing someone you care, that you love, and I really missed that. The other thing is just sitting down, along a kind of massive massive table laden with food and drink and with all your favorite people around you, a multi-generational table, and just having fun. And without getting myself into trouble, I don't think we can do that, or can we? I don't think we can we? We can be sort of mixed with one household, but not lots. So that's still to come. So yeah, so that's what I'm looking forward to, a kind of massive table. Let's see if, what else? So Alexandra Tyler says, the book is next up on my list as soon as I finish my current one. Secondly, lockdown has helped me rethink a lot of things. Okay, so that's not a question, that's a comment. But she said, I found an enthusiasm for the world of news and a passion for journalism, something I'd love to do in the future. And there's a bit more of that. That's so lovely that you are so close to your four sisters and that they are still your best friends. Absolutely, they are. That's from Philippa. Oh, this is interesting. Sarah Hall says, I haven't read the book, but wondered whether the name Kahisa was chosen for its meaning, peace, in Swana. How interesting, Sarah. No, it wasn't actually. Most of the time, I was trying to think of names that A, weren't people I knew, or weren't people well known in South Africa, just in case somebody says, oh God, you're writing about so-and-so. So that's how I lighted on the name Kahisa. But thank you for that. Actually, I didn't know that. So it means peace in Swana, which, for those of you who don't know, I guess is the language in Botswana. Lingham's booksellers say, oh, I love hearing from me. Annie MacDonald says, oh, have you noticed we're 99% women? Does this surprise me? I guess not. I mean, I think, isn't it a fact that women read novels more than men? I may be making that up. Okay. Someone's gonna. But it is obviously based on a time, which of course. Okay, this is I think it's a question anyway from Martina Koenig. I've not read the book, but as you said, it is obviously based on your time in SA, which of course was a very different and special time frame, first years after apartheid. Would you have a different view on aspects now had you been there? Seymour, would you have a different view on aspect now had you been there? Example, 20 years later. Martin, you're absolutely right. Those years, 94 to 98, when I was there with our two sons, Matt and Adam, I hope they remember it actually for what it was, a time of such great optimism and that kind of towering moral presence of Nelson Mandela there, and people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and so many others, people trying to make it work. And it's kind of easy to say, oh well, it didn't quite work out that way. And I know I've written a book that shows one aspect of how things haven't worked out. But actually, freedom is a complicated thing, and in fact, there's a scene in the book, in the novel, about this. That freedom is about the freedom to do the wrong things. Freedom is about the right of black people to get as rich and sometimes as filthy rich as the white people who, excuse me, once dominated South Africa. We may not like it. It may make if you like, leave a bad taste in the mouth. But that is what freedom is about. And Lindy has it. She's minutes into her time in South Africa. She's in a taxi. Again, everybody's talking about this murder that I referred to in my talk earlier. And she sort of says some comment about, he was a very rich man, wasn't he? And the taxi driver just turns on her, oh, so you like your Africans poor, or something like that. I can't remember the exact words. So yes, things are different, but I don't think necessarily they're just becoming normal societies. I mean, we have plenty of things going wrong in our country, and so it would have certainly been a different kind of reporting assignment had I been there now. When we were there, as I say, it was this time of optimism. I mean, and probably epitomised in South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup in 1995. The sport dominated white people. It was like their sort of second religion. Rugby, hated by vast majority of black people, and yet the nation came together behind Francois Pienaar, the captain, and Nelson Mandela wore his jersey, the captain's jersey, and the whole of Ellis Park, the stadium was roaring, Nelson Mandela. So it was an amazing time. I won't forget it, and it's a different time now. Alexander Tyler, can you make any suggestions for pursuing a dream of journalism? Gosh, I think I'm not sure that this is the place, actually, Alexander, to try and answer that. But I'll just see if there's any other questions. You're going to wish you had someone doing this I'm not, by the way, I'm not on Facebook, which is why, I mean, all of this is looking incredibly strange to me. So let's see if we've done that one. I think we've sort of, I mean, there's loads and loads of you saying such lovely things. I'm not sure how many of them are questions. So I think, what's it, I don't know how long we've done, but I think we've done sort of over 50 minutes. If that's it, I think I'm going to call it a day, unless I see something coming in right now. No, I'm sorry. There may be loads more questions there, but I'm just not very good at going through them all. So, can I just say, I hope I haven't shortchanged you. I'm trying to look for. I think we started about 8 o'clock, so it's about 55 minutes. Thank you so much for watching this. If you are, thank you for all the nice things you're